My name is Alice Morgan. I'm 32 years old, and every holiday of my life has carried the same wound. While other families celebrate love and togetherness, mine celebrates comparison. My father never missed a chance to lift my younger sister Olivia onto a pedestal, calling her brilliant, independent, the pride of our family. Vatrong mat ong, toilon la ngoy vo hin. That Christmas Eve, the house glowed with lights and laughter, and my father stood tall with his glass raised high. In front of everyone, he declared that Olivia was living proof of success. Then he looked at me and with a chuckle said, I was still wasting my life behind a computer. The room laughed with him, but my heart didn't shatter this time, because none of them knew the truth. For 2 years, Olivia's perfect image had been built on money she begged from me, $96,000 in total. And before that night was over, the truth was going to burn through every lie they believed. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own family or compared to someone else, stay with me. This story will show you how the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let me take you back to the night it all began. The Morgan house glowed like a Christmas card that night. A tall tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, its branches heavy with silver ornaments that caught the shimmer of the string lights. The smell of baked ham and cinnamon filled the air, blending with the faint sweetness of cookies cooling on the counter. Candles flickered along the mantel, throwing soft golden light across the room, and every surface seemed to hum with the sound of voices layered on top of each other. Relatives had gathered from near and far, cousins chasing each other through the hallway, uncles balancing glasses of wine as they told stories that grew bigger with every retelling, and aunts arranging trays of food as if the feast itself could hold the family together. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. To anyone else, it would have looked like the perfect holiday gathering. The laughter, the warmth, the clinking of glasses, the smell of home. It was everything a Christmas party was supposed to be. But for me, the brightness of the room only made the shadows inside me feel sharper. I had been through too many of these nights to believe in the illusion. I knew the comparisons were coming, as inevitable as the carols playing softly in the background. When I stepped into the room, my father, Henry Morgan, was already at the bar cart with a glass of Cabernet in his hand. His cheeks were flushed from the heat of the fireplace and the attention of the guests gathered around him. He spotted me and smiled, lifting his glass as if to toast me across the room. Alice, he called out, his voice loud enough to carry over the chatter. Glad you could make it. The guests near him turned their heads in my direction, some smiling politely, others barely noticing. I forced a small smile, nodded, and slipped out of the spotlight as quickly as I had been placed in it. That was always my role. Appear, acknowledge, and then fade back into the edges where no one would look too closely. I made my way into the dining room, smoothing my sweater as if that small gesture could steady the hum under my skin. The table stretched almost wall to wall, set with fine china and folded red napkins, each glass sparkling under the chandelier. My Aunt Mary was fussing over a tray of gingerbread cookies while Uncle Tom poured drinks for the cousins who were already crowding near the table. Everyone seemed to fall into their roles so easily, laughter rolling from one side of the room to the other like a wave. It was supposed to be comforting, but to me it only sharpened the ache of not belonging. I chose a seat near the far end, one that gave me a clear view of the room but kept me out of the center. I had learned over the years that the less attention I drew, the smoother the evening went. From my chair, I could see the lights flicker against the polished silverware, could hear the laughter carrying from the living room, could smell the roasted ham making its way from the kitchen. Everything was in its place, as if this house had been built to stage a picture of perfection. But beneath it all, I felt the weight of expectation pressing in. Tonight was going to follow the same script it always had, Or so they believed. From my seat at the far end of the table, I had a perfect view of Olivia as she entered the room. The chatter seemed to hush for a moment, as if the air itself shifted when she walked in. She wore a fitted emerald green dress that caught the light in just the right way. Her blonde hair styled perfectly, every strand falling like it had been arranged for a magazine spread. From where I sat, I could feel the old ache tightening in my chest. I had seen this scene unfold countless times before. Olivia shining effortlessly while I stayed in the background, invisible. The admiration directed at her always seemed to magnify my own silence, as though my quiet existence only underscored her brilliance. I sipped from my glass of water, trying to calm the pulse that was already quickening beneath my skin. Our eyes met briefly across the table. For a split second, her polished smile faltered and turned into something sharper, a flicker of triumph as though she relished my place at the margins. Then the expression vanished, replaced with her usual dazzling grin as she turned back to her audience. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, but I knew that glance well. It was the same one I had seen since we were children, the look that reminded me she was the chosen one and I was the shadow. The sound of silverware clinking against plates filled the room as dinner was served, and the conversation rose again in a lively chorus. Olivia held the center as naturally as breathing, her voice floating over the table, each word drawing nods and laughter. She looked untouchable, wrapped in approval and pride, and for a moment it felt as though the entire evening was orbiting around her. Yet as I sat in the glow of candles and string lights, I felt something stir deep inside me, a steady shift that told me this night would not end the way it always had. The meal unfolded in a blur of chatter and clinking glasses, yet even in that lively noise, the balance of attention never shifted. Olivia sparkled under the chandelier, her laughter rising above the hum of conversation, her stories weaving through the air like carefully rehearsed lines in a play. Plates were filled, wine was poured, and the party glowed with warmth. But beneath it all, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. It was only a matter of time before my father delivered his speech, the one I had heard in countless variations over the years. As if on cue, Henry Morgan pushed back his chair and stood tall at the head of the table. His voice, strong and clear, carried instantly across the room, and the chatter fell away like a curtain dropping before the stage. He raised his glass of red wine, the deep color catching the light as he lifted it higher. "Everyone," he began, his smile broad, "I want to take a moment to honor my youngest daughter, Olivia." The room hushed completely, and all eyes turned to her. Olivia lowered her lashes as though shy, though the curve of her lips betrayed the satisfaction she could not quite hide. My father's chest swelled with pride as he continued, his words rolling out with practiced rhythm. "Olivia has shown us all what it means to be responsible, successful, independent. She has built a life on her own terms. Look at her tonight. Her career, her apartment, her car, everything she has achieved is proof of what determination and focus can accomplish." The guests nodded, some even clapping softly, their faces lit with admiration. My fork hovered above my plate, my hand frozen. His words sliced into me, not because I had not heard them before, but because of the weight they carried in a room full of people. It was one thing to be dismissed privately, another to be diminished in front of a chorus of approving faces. Then his eyes swept the table, and I felt the inevitable shift as his gaze landed on me. His smile tilted into something lighter, a chuckle spilling from his lips as if to soften the blow. "Unlike Alice, who still spends most of her time behind a computer," he added, his tone playful to the ears of others, but sharp enough to sting like broken glass. Laughter bubbled up around the table, hesitant from some, wholehearted from others, and the sound wrapped around me in a suffocating wave. I pressed my lips together, forcing my face into a mask of calm, but inside my stomach tightened. The candlelight flickered across the tablecloth, catching on the crystal glasses that now seemed to mock me with their sparkle. A cousin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward me before dropping quickly to his plate. Across the table, Aunt Mary's smile faltered for a moment, but she said nothing. No one ever said anything. The silence of their complicity hurt almost as much as my father's words. Olivia tilted her head with perfect timing, her smile soft and polished. "Thank you, Dad," she said sweetly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearest guests. "It means the world to be recognized for working so hard." The compliment she accepted so effortlessly cut deeper than the insult directed at me. I clenched my fork under the table, my fingers trembling with a heat that had nothing to do with the wine. For years, I had absorbed these moments, swallowing the pain and letting the script play out as expected. But as the applause rose again in Olivia's honor, I felt something different stir inside me, a steady defiance that I could no longer silence. The sound of applause faded into a blur, each clap echoing in my chest like a cruel reminder of where I stood. For years, I had trained myself to smile faintly and bow my head, to pretend the sting of my father's words did not sink too deep. I had built a habit of silence, convincing myself that it was easier to let the moment pass than to challenge the narrative he so proudly repeated. But that night, as the glow of the candles reflected off Olivia's diamond bracelet and the smug curve of her smile, I felt something shift inside me. I looked down at my plate, the roasted ham untouched, the green beans pushed into a corner, and I realized my appetite had vanished. My fingers tightened around the silver fork until my knuckles whitened. Every word my father had spoken about Olivia replayed in my mind, colliding with every private moment I had endured. The late nights hunched over my computer, the endless calls with suppliers who barely knew my name, the orders I packaged on the floor of my small apartment while Olivia paraded around in silk dresses I had unknowingly funded. My throat burned with the familiar ache of wanting to speak, wanting to defend myself, but something new pressed against it this time. It was no longer just hurt. It was anger, sharp and steady, and beneath it, a sense of clarity that startled me. I had spent so many years believing that silence was strength, that ignoring the humiliation gave me power. But in that moment, I saw how wrong I had been. Silence had only given them permission to keep seeing me as less. I lifted my glass of water, my hand trembling slightly at first. But when I set it back down on the table, the tremor was gone. Across from me, Aunt Mary caught my eye, her brow furrowing as though she sensed the storm building behind my calm expression. She offered a small, sympathetic smile, but she too said nothing. Her silence, though gentle, reminded me how alone I had always been in this room. The voices around me rose again, laughter spilling back into the space my father's toast had left behind. Olivia launched into another story, this one about a shopping trip to Los Angeles, her words dripping with glamour as she described rooftop dinners and designer bags. The guests leaned in eagerly, enchanted by her picture-perfect life, never once questioning how it was possible on her modest salary. I felt the heat rise in my chest again, but this time it steadied me rather than shaking me. I straightened in my seat, my back no longer pressed against the chair as if trying to disappear. My heart pounded, but not from fear. For the first time in years, I felt calm, almost cold in my resolve. I knew what I carried, and I knew how much power the truth held. $96,000, 2 years of sacrifice, every transfer, every late night, every humiliation endured while Olivia basked in stolen glory. I breathed slowly, my chest rising and falling with deliberate steadiness, and with each breath I felt stronger. Around me, the party carried on as though nothing had changed. But within me, everything had. I was no longer the quiet daughter who absorbed the insults and let them pass. I was ready to let the truth break free, and I could sense the moment drawing closer with every passing second. As the laughter carried on around the table, I felt my mind drift away from the glittering chandelier and the polished silverware in front of me. The present blurred, and I was pulled back into memories of holidays past, each one etched into me with painful clarity. Every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every Christmas had followed the same script. My father raising his voice over the crowd, his words warm when they were directed at Olivia and cold when they landed on me. I remembered a Thanksgiving when Olivia was still in college. She had flown home for the break, arriving in a sleek black coat that looked far too expensive for a student. My father beamed as she walked through the door, bragging to our relatives about her grades, her charm, her bright future. "Olivia is going to make something of herself," he said proudly, resting a hand on her shoulder like she was his greatest accomplishment. Then his eyes found me, standing a few feet behind her, and he added with a laugh, "Alice could learn a thing or two from her sister." The words were said casually, tossed into the air like harmless banter, but I still felt the sting in my chest long after the meal was over. Another memory surfaced, this one from Easter Sunday a few years later. The table had been filled with pastel flowers and bowls of bright candies, the cousins darting around the house in their hunt for plastic eggs. My father gathered everyone together and once again singled Olivia out, praising her internship in New York as though it were proof of her brilliance. I had been working 2 jobs at the time, balancing shifts at a coffee shop while building my small online store at night, but none of that was mentioned. To him, my sacrifices were invisible. He spoke of Olivia's accomplishments as if they belonged to the whole family, while mine were treated as hobbies barely worth acknowledging. Even the 4th of July had carried its own brand of humiliation. I could still see the fireflies blinking in the backyard, the grill smoking with burgers, the neighbors gathered with sparklers. My father had introduced Olivia to a family friend, a lawyer with connections, boasting that she was the pride of our household. When the man asked about me, my father chuckled and waved his hand as if dismissing the question. "Alice keeps herself busy online," he said, the same phrase he always used, vague and dismissive, designed to end the conversation. The friend nodded politely and the subject was dropped, but I carried the weight of that dismissal for weeks. These moments blended together over the years, forming a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Olivia was always the shining star, my father's favorite story to tell, while I was the afterthought, the one who never quite measured up. The warmth that should have come with family gatherings turned instead into dread, each holiday a performance where I knew my role too well. Sitting at the Christmas table now, listening to the applause in Olivia's honor, I realized that every past humiliation had led me to this moment. The anger rising in my chest was not born tonight. It had been building for years, growing stronger with each toast, each chuckle, each reminder that in my father's eyes, I was never enough. Those holiday memories were only fragments of a much larger pattern, one that had been woven into my life since childhood. The favoritism was not reserved for festive dinners. It was stitched into the fabric of our everyday existence. From the very beginning, my father had made it clear who he believed was destined for greatness. I remembered the mornings before school when Olivia and I would come downstairs together. She was always dressed in new clothes, carefully chosen by my father, who insisted she should look her best. Her shoes were polished, her hair neatly styled, and if she ever needed something extra, my father never hesitated. He called it an investment in her future. My clothes, in contrast, were often hand-downs or bargains my mother quietly bought without comment. If I ever asked for something more, my father would shake his head and say it was unnecessary, that I should learn to be practical. The same imbalance showed up in school opportunities. When Olivia expressed interest in dance classes, my father signed her up for the most expensive studio in town. He drove her to rehearsals, sat proudly in the audience at her recitals, and bragged to his friends about her talent. When I asked to join a science club, he told me it was a waste of time, that I should focus on something useful like helping at home. His refusal never came with anger. It was worse than that. It came with dismissal, a quiet certainty that my passions did not matter enough to pursue. Even as we grew older, the divide only deepened. When Olivia graduated from high school, my father threw a grand party in the backyard, complete with catered food and a live band. The whole neighborhood was invited, and he toasted to her bright future, telling everyone she was destined for success. When it was my turn to graduate, we had a small dinner at home. No decorations, no big speech, just a quiet evening where my accomplishments were overshadowed by whatever Olivia happened to be doing at the time. The disparity carried into adulthood. Olivia's first car was a shiny new sedan that my father helped her finance, bragging that she deserved something safe and reliable. I bought my first car secondhand, after months of saving from part-time jobs. My father never mentioned it to anyone. When Olivia moved into her first apartment, he gifted her with furniture and helped cover the deposit. When I signed the lease on my tiny one-bedroom, he shook his head and told me not to waste money on rent. Each memory settled over me now like layers of dust I had never managed to wipe away. The imbalance was not just about material things. It was about recognition, about being seen. Olivia was celebrated for every step she took, no matter how small, while my own achievements dissolved into silence before they even reached his ears. Sitting at the Christmas table that night, I realized that my anger was not only about the speech my father had just given. It was about years of being denied the simple dignity of acknowledgement, about being told in 100 subtle ways that I was less. As those memories resurfaced, I felt the old conflict pressing against my chest, a tug of war I had carried inside me for years. No matter how many times my father dismissed me, no matter how clearly he favored Olivia, a part of me still wanted his approval. I hated admitting it, even to myself. But beneath the anger, there was a quiet yearning for recognition. It was the kind of longing that made every insult cut deeper, because I wanted so badly for him to see me as more than the invisible daughter. I remembered nights in my small apartment, the glow of my computer screen lighting the room as I worked until dawn. I told myself I was building something real, something I could be proud of even if he never noticed. Yet when exhaustion hit, I would catch myself imagining what it would feel like if my father walked through the door, looked at the spreadsheets and the packages stacked against the wall, and finally said he was proud of me. That fantasy was as painful as it was persistent, because I knew it would never come true. At family gatherings, the tension always grew sharper. I would walk in with gifts carefully wrapped, food I had cooked with my own hands, and I would place them quietly on the table. My father rarely commented. Then Olivia would stroll in late, carrying a box of pastries she had bought on the way, and he would shower her with praise as though she had moved mountains. I would sit in the corner, smiling as best I could. But inside I fought the urge to cry, or to stand up and scream that I mattered too. There was love in me still, despite the hurt. I loved my mother for trying to soften the edges, for the small looks of apology she sent me across the table when my father went too far. I even loved Olivia once, back when we were children and she was simply my sister and not my rival. But love tangled with resentment until I could hardly tell them apart. I wanted to protect my family, yet I also wanted to expose the truth of how their favoritism had broken me piece by piece. The hardest part was the silence. Speaking up felt impossible, because every time I had tried in the past, my words were brushed aside. My father would laugh, call me sensitive, and the room would move on as though nothing had happened. That silence became a cage I built around myself, convincing me that holding my tongue was the only way to survive. But the cost of that silence was heavy. Each time I swallowed my pain, the weight inside me grew, pressing harder against my ribs, making it difficult to breathe. Now, sitting at the Christmas table with his latest toast echoing in my ears, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by this inner conflict. I wanted to belong, to be seen and valued, but I also wanted to break free from the endless cycle of comparisons. For years, I had chosen silence, hoping it would keep the peace. But that silence had only deepened my scars. And in that moment, I knew something inside me was shifting. The part of me that wanted peace was beginning to lose to the part that wanted justice. What made the wounds cut even deeper was not only my father's favoritism, but the way everyone else accepted it as if it were natural. At every family gathering, people witnessed the imbalance, yet no one dared to challenge it. Their silence was a kind of agreement, and it left me more isolated than words ever could. I remembered one particular Christmas when I had just launched my small business. I had stayed up for weeks perfecting the website, packaging orders, and negotiating with suppliers who barely returned my calls. It was the hardest thing I had ever attempted, and though it was small, I was proud of it. That evening, I brought my laptop to show my parents what I was building. I imagined my father might at least nod, perhaps ask a few questions. But as soon as I began to explain, Olivia walked into the room carrying shopping bags from a designer store. The conversation turned instantly. My aunts and cousins gathered around her, marveling at the clothes, asking about the boutique in New York. My father didn't even glance at my screen. I closed the laptop quietly and set it aside. The sting of dismissal sinking deeper because everyone else saw it happen and said nothing. There were other times, too. Moments when family friends were present. At barbecues in the summer, my father would introduce Olivia to his colleagues with pride, boasting about her apartment and her job, painting her as the perfect daughter. When the conversation shifted to me, he waved it off with a dismissive smile, saying I was still figuring things out. The men would nod politely, the women would smile sympathetically, and no one asked me a single question. They looked at me as though I were a guest at my own family's table. Even my cousins, who were closest to my age, fell into the rhythm of silence. Some of them looked uncomfortable when my father belittled me, shifting in their seats or glancing in my direction with pity. But none of them ever spoke. Their silence was worse than mockery. It felt like confirmation that maybe they agreed, that maybe I really was less. That quiet complicity wove itself into my skin until I started to believe it. The world outside the family wasn't much different. Teachers praised Olivia for her charm while overlooking my persistence. Friends echoed my father's words, admiring her boldness and overlooking my discipline. The narrative that Olivia was the star and I was the shadow spread beyond our home, carried on whispers and assumptions until it felt like a truth no one questioned. Sitting at the Christmas table now, I felt the weight of all those years pressing against me. It wasn't just my father's words that hurt. It was the echo of everyone else's silence, the collective agreement that Olivia deserved the pedestal and I deserved the corner. That silence had followed me through childhood into adulthood, shaping me into someone who doubted her own worth, even as she worked harder than anyone in the room. But as I listened to the applause for Olivia, a strange strength rose in me. Their silence had once been my cage, but tonight I could feel it cracking. For the first time, I was not afraid of breaking it wide open. The longer I sat at that table, the more I realized that silence had been the weapon used against me all my life. My father's words had stung, but it was the quiet acceptance of everyone else that had carved the deepest scars. That silence told me my pain was not worth noticing, my efforts not worth praising, my presence not worth acknowledging. And yet, sitting there beneath the glow of the chandelier, I felt that silence begin to lose its power over me. I thought about all the years I had worked in the shadows, pouring my energy into something no one believed in. Every late night I spent hunched over my computer, every package I sealed by hand, every rejection email that I answered with stubborn persistence. All of it had been invisible to my family. To them, my labor was meaningless, but to me, it had built something solid, something that no one could take away. I had been dismissed as a failure, but I was living proof that quiet determination could create its own kind of success. And then there was Olivia, the sister who had grown up basking in the glow of our father's pride, who had been handed opportunities I could only dream of, who had learned how to charm every room she entered. She had always worn the crown, but I knew better than anyone that it was hollow. For years, she had leaned on me in secret, begging for money to keep her life afloat. $96,000 had passed from my account to hers, each transfer another piece of my sacrifice, another stone added to the foundation of her false independence. While the world applauded her, I carried her truth in silence, protecting her even as she allowed me to be ridiculed. That contradiction had become unbearable. I had loved her once, the way sisters are meant to love each other. But love had twisted into something darker when she chose her image over our bond. Each time she stood tall and accepted my father's praise, knowing it was built on my support, she betrayed me. And I betrayed myself by staying quiet. But as I sat at the Christmas table, listening to the laughter that followed my father's cruel joke, I felt something inside me harden into resolve. The years of being overlooked had forged a strength I had not fully recognized until now. Their silence had once made me doubt my worth, but tonight it gave me clarity. If no one else would speak the truth, then I would. I glanced at Olivia, her emerald dress shimmering under the lights, her smile radiant as she soaked in the admiration of the room. For everyone else, she was the image of success. But to me, she was a mask I was ready to tear away. My fingers curled against the stem of my glass. Steady now, no longer trembling. I knew the moment was coming. The silence that had defined my life was about to break, and once it did, nothing in this family would ever be the same again. The first time Olivia came to me for help was a night I will never forget. It had been raining hard, the kind of relentless downpour that blurred the streetlights and soaked through clothes in seconds. I was sitting at my desk surrounded by stacks of packaging tape and boxes, trying to keep up with orders, when I heard the frantic knocking at my apartment door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, but when I opened it, Olivia stood there. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, her hair plastered against her face, her expensive coat dripping water onto the hallway carpet. She looked nothing like the flawless sister who turned heads at family gatherings. She looked small, desperate and terrified. "Alice," she choked, clutching her handbag like it was a lifeline. I didn't know where else to go. Her voice cracked, and before I could say anything, she pushed past me into the apartment, pacing the small living room with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I closed the door behind her, heart racing, unsure what storm had driven her here. She began to speak in fragments, words tumbling out between sobs. She had fallen behind on her rent. Credit card bills were piling up. Her car payment was overdue. The glamorous image she showed the world was unraveling, and she was terrified that our father would find out. I stood there frozen, listening to her desperation fill the room. And for the first time, I saw my golden sister stripped of all the shine. Part of me wanted to ask why she had chosen me, the sister she so often ignored, the one she let our father belittle without a word in my defense. But another part of me felt something else, an old instinct to protect her, a flicker of love that no amount of favoritism could erase. She looked so broken, her shoulders shaking, her voice trembling, that my resentment softened for a moment. When she finally met my eyes, her face streaked with tears, she whispered, Please, Alice. Just a little help. I promise it's temporary. I'll get back on my feet, and no one will ever have to know. The vulnerability in her tone pierced through my anger, and I found myself nodding before I had even thought it through. I told her I would transfer money to her account, enough to cover the rent and bills for that month. Relief flooded her features instantly, and she clutched my hands like I had saved her life. After she left, the apartment felt heavier than before. I sat back at my desk, staring at the open boxes, the blinking cursor on my computer screen, and the bank app still glowing on my phone. I told myself it was just this once, that I was helping my sister because family meant more than resentment. But deep down, I felt the unease settle into my chest. Something told me this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a secret I would carry alone, a secret that would grow heavier with each passing month. It should have ended that night. A single moment of weakness, a one-time act of compassion between sisters. At least that is what I told myself as I transferred the money to Olivia's account and tried to return to my work. But weeks later, another message appeared on my phone, her name lighting up the screen just after midnight. Her words were frantic, filled with panic about another overdue bill, another emergency she could not handle. My chest tightened as I read them, and before I could reason my way out of it, I sent her more money. 1 month turned into 2, and then into 3. Soon the requests stopped sounding like emergencies and began to feel like routine. She always promised it would be the last time, her voice trembling with gratitude when we spoke. But somehow there was always a new crisis. Rent, car repairs, medical bills, credit cards. Each time she came to me, I convinced myself that family meant sacrifice, that it was my duty to protect her even if she had never protected me. At first, I tried to keep track, making notes in a small journal, writing down every transfer so I could remind myself it was real. But the numbers grew faster than I wanted to admit. $4,000 one month, $4,000 the next, and soon the total began to climb into the tens of thousands. I would sit at my desk at night, staring at the ledger, wondering how long I could keep carrying her weight without collapsing under it. Meanwhile, Olivia's life outside my apartment looked brighter than ever. On social media, she posted pictures of rooftop dinners, luxury handbags, weekend trips. At family gatherings, she wore new clothes and told stories of her success, basking in the admiration of our father and the approving nods of relatives. No one knew that the glow around her was lit by my sacrifices. They saw her as independent and strong, while I was dismissed as the quiet one with nothing to show. Each time I heard my father brag about her, a knot tightened inside me. I wanted to shout the truth, to tell him that Olivia's independence was an illusion built on my support. But then I remembered the way she had looked that first night, broken and terrified, and I kept my silence. I told myself that exposing her would destroy what little bond we had left, and despite everything, I wasn't ready to let go of being her sister. Still, the resentment grew. I would catch myself staring at the glowing screen of my banking app, watching the balance shrink with every transfer, and I wondered if she even realized the sacrifices I was making. Did she understand the hours I worked, the exhaustion I carried, the risks I took just to keep my business alive while also carrying her? Or did she simply believe it was her right to lean on me, the sister who had always been invisible? By the end of the second year, the total had reached $96,000. The weight of that number pressed on me every day, a secret that filled my chest with both guilt and fury. I had given so much, yet in return I received nothing but silence, while Olivia wore the crown of success our father placed on her head. That crown, I knew now, was paid for in full by me. Family gatherings became the cruelest stage of all. Each time the Morgans came together, Olivia arrived like a queen stepping into her court, her smile dazzling, her perfume lingering in the air long after she walked past. She would glide into the dining room carrying shopping bags or dressed in something new and glittering, and without fail, the spotlight found her. My father beamed with pride, his voice swelling as he drew attention to her dress, her apartment, her car, all the proof he needed of her independence. I remember one particular Thanksgiving with sharp clarity. The table was crowded with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and pies cooling on the counter, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and cloves. Relatives filled every seat, their laughter rising and falling like music. Olivia walked in late, her entrance perfectly timed, wearing a coat that shimmered under the light. She slipped it off her shoulders to reveal a silk blouse, the kind that cost more than a month's rent on my tiny apartment. Gasps and compliments followed instantly. My father clapped his hands together and said, "Now this is what success looks like." Everyone turned to admire her while I sat at the far end of the table, my fork motionless against my plate. No one asked how she managed to afford it. No one questioned the life she flaunted. And I, the one who had paid for it, sat invisible. Christmas parties were no different. Olivia told stories of rooftop dinners in Chicago, weekend trips to Aspen, handbags that sparkled with designer labels. She described her life as though she had built it with her own hands, and the guests soaked in every word. My father raised his glass again and again, his pride unshakable, his praise overflowing. When someone's eyes turned toward me, he would chuckle lightly and say, "Alice spends too much time on that computer of hers." The room would laugh, and just like that, the attention shifted back to Olivia. Each time it happened, I felt the anger rise higher in my chest. I could see the bracelet on her wrist, the handbag by her chair, the shoes she crossed neatly under the table, and I knew exactly whose money had bought them. My own bank statements told the story no one else seemed to see. The irony was suffocating. She was celebrated for her independence while I was ridiculed for mine. Yet her glow was fueled entirely by the sacrifices I made in silence. What cut deepest was her composure. Not once did Olivia hesitate. She accepted every compliment with practiced humility, tilting her head and saying thank you with a sweetness that made it impossible for anyone to doubt her. And all the while, she glanced at me from across the table, her eyes sharp with the unspoken knowledge of our secret. She knew the truth. I knew the truth. But she also knew I would never speak it. That confidence allowed her to stand taller, while I shrank deeper into the shadows. Those gatherings became unbearable. I would return home afterward, collapsing into bed with exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. My resentment grew with every holiday, my heart torn between the love that made me want to protect my sister and the bitterness that screamed she was using me. It was a cruel paradox, one I carried alone, until the weight of it began to crack something inside me. The cruelest betrayal was not just that Olivia used my money to build her image, but that she twisted the story so thoroughly that even my father believed she was the one holding me up. It started subtly, with small comments slipped into conversations. At one family dinner, I overheard her telling an aunt that she had always tried to support me, that she worried I spent too much time isolated with my computer, and that sometimes she helped cover my expenses to make sure I was all right. The words slid off her tongue easily, sweet enough to sound like concern, but sharp enough to carve me into the role of the dependent sister. I froze when I heard it, a fork halfway to my mouth, unable to believe what she was saying. My aunt nodded in sympathy, her eyes turning toward me with pity, and I wanted to scream that it was a lie. But the room moved on quickly, the conversation drifting toward lighter topics, and once again my silence bound me. I swallowed the food in my mouth, though it tasted like ash, and reminded myself that protecting the secret had been my choice. But now that secret was being used against me. The whispers grew over time. At another gathering, my father mentioned proudly that Olivia had such a generous heart, always looking out for her older sister. He chuckled and added that perhaps I should be more grateful for her help. The word struck me like a slap across the face. Grateful. Grateful for the sister who drained me month after month, who lived a life of luxury while I worked until my hands ached. My father said it so casually, with a warm smile directed at her, and the room applauded her kindness. No one thought to question the story, because it fit so neatly with the image Olivia projected. I began to notice the way people looked at me after that. Their smiles carried a hint of pity, as if I were someone who could not stand on her own. The narrative Olivia had spun was taking root, reshaping the way my family saw me. I was no longer just the quiet one behind a computer. I was now the sister who needed saving, the dependent who leaned on Olivia's supposed generosity. It was a humiliation so sharp I could barely breathe when I thought about it. Every night when I sat at my desk packaging orders, I would think about those comments, about the looks that followed me at family events, and the resentment inside me burned hotter. I was sacrificing everything for Olivia's illusion, yet she had the audacity to cast herself as my protector. My silence, once an act of love, had become the very rope she used to bind me tighter to the shadows. I knew then that the balance between us could not hold forever. A truth this heavy could not remain hidden, not when it was twisting my life and feeding her lies. And though I still had no plan, a seed of determination was taking root in me. Someday I would break the silence. Someday I would let the truth fall, no matter how hard it shattered the world she had built. By the end of the second year, the weight of it all had become unbearable. My savings had thinned to a dangerous edge, every transfer to Olivia carving away at the security I had worked so hard to build. Each month I told myself it would be the last, but then her messages came again, urgent and pleading, her voice trembling over the phone as she swore she had no one else to turn to. And every time, against my better judgment, I gave in. I watched the balance in my account shrink, while Olivia's life seemed to shine brighter with every party she attended, every photograph she posted, every compliment she received. It was not only the money that drained me, but the lies that grew heavier with each gathering. The image Olivia projected had become a trap I could not escape. My father believed she was generous, self-sufficient, and noble enough to help her struggling sister. The relatives pitied me while applauding her. Friends of the family nodded approvingly at the stories she told. And through it all, I sat silent, swallowing the bitter taste of betrayal while the truth pressed harder against my ribs. I remember one night sitting at my desk, my laptop open, orders waiting to be processed, but my hands frozen above the keyboard. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, but inside my head the noise was deafening. Numbers swirled in front of me, the total I had given her climbing higher in my ledger. $96,000. I whispered it out loud, as though saying it might make it feel real. 96,000. Nearly 2 years of my sweat and labor siphoned away, hidden behind the curtain of her false success. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. For the first time, anger outweighed guilt. I thought about all the nights I went without sleep, all the weekends I skipped outings with friends, all the times I told myself that building my business mattered more than anything. And then I thought about Olivia, smiling effortlessly at our father, accepting praise she had not earned, casting herself as the savior of the sister she had bled dry. The contrast was unbearable. The silence that had once felt like sacrifice now felt like complicity. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the city faint against my blinds. I realized I had become a prisoner of my own choice. I had given her the power to define me, to rewrite my story while I stood by and let it happen. And the thought that haunted me most was simple, but sharp. If I didn't speak soon, if I didn't find a way to break free, I would lose myself entirely. The next morning, as I packed orders into boxes and printed shipping labels, the resolve began to harden inside me. I was done being invisible. I was done funding her lies. The next time my father lifted his glass and praised Olivia's independence, I would not sit quietly. I would not let the world believe her story at the expense of mine. The truth was burning in me, and I knew the day was coming when I would finally let it out. The clinking of glasses echoed through the dining room as the chatter began to settle. I felt the air shift, the way it always did right before my father rose to speak. My pulse quickened, but this time it wasn't from dread alone. It was anticipation, a restless energy that surged through me as if my body already knew what I was about to do. Henry pushed back his chair and stood tall at the head of the table. The light from the chandelier caught the deep red of the wine in his glass, making it gleam as he raised it high. "Family," he began, his voice clear and commanding. "Tonight we gather not just to celebrate Christmas, but to honor what it means to succeed, to stand on your own 2 feet." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, his gaze sweeping over the table before landing squarely on Olivia. "My youngest daughter," he said with a proud smile, "is living proof of what independence and hard work can accomplish. Olivia has built a life many only dream of. Her apartment in Denver, her career, the way she carries herself. It's all a reflection of discipline and determination. She is the kind of daughter any father would be proud to claim." His voice swelled with emotion, and the guests responded with nods and murmurs of approval. A few clapped, their faces glowing with admiration as Olivia lowered her eyes in a show of modesty, though the curve of her lips betrayed her satisfaction. The familiar sting cut through me, sharp and bitter, but underneath it a steady fire burned. I had been here countless times before, shrinking under the weight of his words, but tonight felt different. Tonight, I had a truth so heavy it could no longer be contained. My father lifted his glass a little higher and, as if to complete the ritual, turned his gaze toward me. "And then, of course, we have Alice," he added, his tone light, almost teasing. "Still glued to that computer of hers, working on whatever it is she does. Maybe one day she'll follow her sister's example and show us all what success really looks like." Laughter rippled around the table, some polite, some genuine, and the sound washed over me like icy water. I set my fork down carefully, the metal clicking against the plate louder than it should have been. My heart pounded in my ears, but my face stayed calm. For years, I had let this script play out, absorbing every slight, every chuckle, every dismissal. But not this time. Not when the lie had grown this large. Not when the truth weighed so heavily inside me it threatened to tear me apart if I stayed silent any longer. I lifted my glass of water, taking a slow sip, my eyes never leaving Olivia. She avoided my gaze, her attention fixed on the guests who still smiled at her with admiration. My father continued to beam with pride, his chest puffed with satisfaction. None of them knew the storm gathering just beneath the surface. And as I set the glass back on the table, my hand steady now, I realized the moment I had been waiting for had arrived. The silence that had defined me was about to end. The laughter still lingered in the air when I pushed my chair back. The sound of wood scraping against the floor drew a few curious glances, but I didn't care. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was a steady drumbeat of resolve. I rose slowly, letting the weight of the moment gather as I straightened my shoulders. "Since we're talking about independence," I said, my voice calm but cutting through the chatter like a blade, "maybe it's time we all get the story straight." The room quieted almost instantly. Every eye turned toward me, some confused, some already uneasy. My father froze, his glass still lifted, his smile faltering just enough for me to notice. Olivia's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide, her lips parting as though she could stop me with a look. I kept my gaze steady on her. Not my father, not the guests. Her. You've all been told that Olivia built her perfect life on her own. I continued, each word deliberate. Her apartment, her car, her glamorous nights out. But the truth is, for the last 2 years, every bit of it has been paid for by me. Gasps rippled across the table, sharp intakes of breath breaking the silence. Olivia shook her head quickly, her voice trembling as she tried to laugh it off. Alice, what are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous. But the tremor in her tone betrayed her. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag on the chair beside me, pulling out a small folder I had brought with me, though I hadn't been certain until now that I would use it. My fingers brushed against the papers as I opened it and laid the documents on the table. Bank transfers, printed statements, line after line of proof. $96,000, I said firmly. Month after month, I sent her $4,000 to keep her afloat. While you all praised her independence, I was the one carrying her. The silence was deafening. Forks rested midair, glasses hovered above the table, no one daring to move. My father's face darkened, his smile erased, his jaw tightening as he looked from me to Olivia. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Olivia's voice rose first, high-pitched and desperate. That's not true. She's twisting everything. Stop. I cut in, my voice louder now, firm enough to shake the edges of the room. You came to me crying, Olivia, begging me not to let anyone find out. I gave up my savings, my nights, my peace of mind, so you could keep living this lie. And all the while, you let him, I pointed at my father, stand up here and mock me while he crowned you the family success story. Whispers broke out around the table, some guests covering their mouths, others staring openly at Olivia with disbelief. My father's hand trembled as he set his glass down on the table. The pride that had once filled his voice was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made every second feel longer. I remained standing, my heart steady now. The truth finally out. The weight I had carried for 2 years was no longer mine alone. The room erupted in a low murmur, voices overlapping in disbelief, but Olivia's shrill protest cut through the noise. She pushed back her chair, her face pale under the chandelier's light, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. She's lying, she stammered, her eyes darting around the table as though searching for someone to defend her. Alice is jealous. She always has been. She can't stand to see me succeed, so now she's making up stories to ruin me. I remained standing, my gaze steady. I didn't need to shout. The papers lying on the table spoke louder than anything I could say. My father leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he scanned the pages, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time in years, he wasn't smiling at Olivia. Her boyfriend, Daniel, cleared his throat, the tension in his voice unmistakable. Olivia, he said slowly, is this true? His eyes flicked to her, sharp and searching. I've asked you before how you could afford all of this. The trips, the designer clothes when your job doesn't cover half of it. You always had an answer, but... He glanced down at the statements, his face hardening. Were you using Alice's money? Olivia's voice cracked as she tried to laugh. Daniel, don't listen to this. She's exaggerating. It wasn't like that. She offered. I never... Her words faltered as she saw the disbelief growing in his eyes. Around the table, whispers grew louder. A cousin leaned toward another, muttering something that made both of them shake their heads. An aunt clutched her napkin tightly, her gaze fixed on Olivia with something close to disgust. The admiration that had once surrounded her was shifting, tilting into suspicion, even contempt. I took a step closer, my voice low but firm. You begged me, Olivia. You cried on my couch, telling me you couldn't make rent, that your car would be repossessed. I didn't do this to humiliate you. I did it because I loved you. Because I thought family meant helping each other. But while I carried you, you let everyone believe you were the strong one and you let them laugh at me. My father's hand slammed down on the table, the sound startling everyone into silence. His face was flushed, his eyes blazing with anger, but it wasn't directed at me. Is it true? He demanded, his voice shaking. Olivia, did your sister pay for all of this? Olivia's lips trembled, her eyes darting from face to face, but no words came out. Daniel pushed his chair back abruptly, the scrape loud in the stunned silence. I can't do this, he muttered, his voice thick with disappointment. He looked at her one last time before walking away from the table, leaving Olivia standing there, her mask cracking for everyone to see. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. For the first time, the golden image of Olivia Morgan wavered, and there was no applause to savor. Olivia stood frozen, her breath uneven, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if the wood itself could hold her together. The confident smile she had worn so effortlessly all evening was gone, replaced by a trembling mask that cracked with every second of silence. Around her, the eyes that once looked at her with admiration now studied her with suspicion, pity, and even disgust. The shift in the room was undeniable, and there was no curtain she could pull across the stage to hide it. My father's face was ashen, his pride shattered into something raw and far more dangerous. He leaned back slowly, his hand dragging down his jaw as if the weight of realization was too heavy to hold. All these years, he muttered, almost to himself, I praised you. I defended you. I built you up while I mocked your sister. His eyes lifted, red-rimmed now, and locked onto Olivia with a fury I had never seen in him before. Was it all a lie? Olivia shook her head frantically, her voice hoarse from panic. Dad, please, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. Alice offered. She wanted to help. I was just trying to find my footing, and I didn't want to disappoint you. She reached toward him, her hand trembling, but he pulled back as if her touch might burn him. The rejection made her falter, her knees buckling slightly as she sank back into her chair. The guests murmured again, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind raised hands. My Aunt Mary, who had always kept her distance from conflict, spoke up softly but firmly. Henry, we all saw how you treated Alice over the years. You never once gave her credit for her work. And now it seems Olivia has been hiding behind her all along. Her words landed heavily, because they came not from anger but from quiet truth. I remained standing, my chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. I had imagined this moment many times, but seeing it unfold was almost surreal. For years, I had been invisible at this table, my existence overshadowed by Olivia's shine and my father's blindness. Now, the roles were reversing in real time, and the room itself felt like it was tilting. Olivia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as muffled sobs broke through the fragile silence. No one moved to comfort her. Even those who once adored her seemed paralyzed, unsure if they were watching the fall of a daughter or the unmasking of a stranger. My father finally turned toward me. His expression was torn, lined with shame and regret, but also with something I had longed to see my whole life: recognition. For a moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as though words had abandoned him. Then, in a voice that was almost broken, he whispered, Alice, I was wrong. The weight of those words settled over the table heavier than any toast he had ever given. Olivia's sobs filled the silence, and for the first time I was no longer the invisible daughter. The silence at the table grew unbearable, stretching longer with each second. Olivia's sobs filled the air, raw and desperate, the sound of a mask shattering in front of everyone she had worked so hard to impress. She lifted her face, streaked with mascara, her eyes wide with desperation as they darted from one guest to another. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to keep up, to make Dad proud." No one responded. The same family that had once clapped for her stories now sat in heavy silence, their faces unreadable. Some looked down at their plates, others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unwilling to meet her gaze. Even those who had adored her the most seemed unable to offer comfort. The pedestal she had stood on for so long had crumbled, and there was no one left to hold her up. My father leaned back in his chair, his eyes hard as stone. The pride that had once filled his voice was gone, replaced by bitter disappointment. "You lied to all of us," he said quietly, though the words cut sharper than any shout. "You let me believe you were everything I hoped for, and all along you were living on your sister's sacrifices." He shook his head slowly, his jaw tightening. "I can forgive mistakes, Olivia, but I cannot forgive deceit." Olivia let out a strangled sob and stumbled to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her coat from the back of the chair, nearly knocking over a wine glass in her haste. "I can't stay here," she whispered, though no one tried to stop her. She hurried toward the door, her heels clicking unevenly on the hardwood, her movements frantic and clumsy. For the first time in her life, she was running not toward admiration, but away from shame. The front door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house like the final note of a song that had ended too suddenly. The room remained still, the faint jingles of Christmas carols playing from the living room stereo clashing awkwardly with the heaviness of the silence. I remained standing for a moment, my breath steady, my hands no longer trembling. Slowly, I lowered myself back into my chair. The eyes that turned toward me were different now. No longer filled with pity or dismissal, they carried something heavier. Recognition, respect, even remorse. A cousin across the table gave me a small nod, his expression apologetic. My Aunt Mary reached out, her hand brushing mine in a gesture of quiet support. My father still sat in silence, his gaze fixed on his glass of wine. But the weight in his eyes told me the truth had finally pierced through years of blindness. I had not come to the dinner expecting applause, and I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was release. The truth was out, the silence broken. The years of being invisible ended in a single night. As I sat there in the glow of the chandelier, the empty chair beside me where Olivia had been only moments before, I knew the balance in our family had shifted forever. The house felt hollow after the front door slammed shut behind Olivia. For a long moment, no one moved, the air thick with the echo of her footsteps fading into the night. The chandelier's glow shimmered across the table, reflecting in the untouched glasses of wine, but the warmth of the evening had vanished. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier laughter replaced by whispers that rippled from one end of the room to the other. My father sat stiffly at the head of the table, his hand wrapped tightly around the stem of his glass, though he didn't lift it. His eyes were fixed on the doorway where Olivia had disappeared, the weight of shame dragging his shoulders down. The pride that had once filled his chest was gone, leaving behind a hollow shell of regret. Around him, the relatives avoided his gaze, their silence heavy with judgment. It was not only Olivia who had been unmasked tonight, but also the man who had placed her on a pedestal while mocking his other daughter. Daniel stood near the door, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with a disappointment that seemed deeper than anger. For years, he had been by Olivia's side, listening to her stories, believing her illusions, defending her choices. Now the foundation of that relationship had cracked beyond repair. He shook his head slowly, his voice heavy when he finally spoke. "I can't build a life on lies, Olivia," he said, though she was no longer there to hear him. With that, he slipped on his coat and left through the same door, his footsteps decisive, the finality of his departure echoing through the house. The guests began to murmur again, some in hushed tones of sympathy for me, others in sharp whispers about Olivia's deception. A cousin leaned close to another and muttered that they had always wondered how she could afford the life she flaunted. An uncle sighed, shaking his head as though the revelation confirmed a suspicion he had buried. The room, once filled with admiration for Olivia, now buzzed with speculation and disappointment. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, absorbing the shifting energy around me. For years I had been the subject of pity, the one overlooked, dismissed, compared until I disappeared. Now the eyes that turned toward me carried something different. Some were apologetic, some were thoughtful, but none of them looked at me with mockery. For the first time, I was not invisible. My father finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "Go on with dessert," he said, though no one moved to touch the pies cooling on the counter. His command carried no authority anymore, only exhaustion. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing briefly as though the weight of his own blindness had finally crushed him. As the night wore on, the guests excused themselves one by one, coats draped over their arms, their goodbyes soft and uncomfortable. The festive glow of Christmas had dissolved into something far colder. By the time the house emptied, only silence remained, heavy and unyielding. Olivia had left in disgrace. Daniel had left her behind, and my father sat with his head bowed. The golden image of the family's perfect daughter had shattered, and the shards were scattered across the floor of our holiday gathering. In the days that followed the Christmas party, whispers spread quickly beyond the walls of our home. News of what had happened traveled through relatives, neighbors, and friends, until Olivia's carefully built image began to unravel in public. The same people who once admired her now exchanged stories in lowered voices, each one a piece of gossip that chipped away at the pedestal she had lived on for so long. Olivia tried at first to maintain her facade. On social media, she posted smiling photos from weeks before, dressed in glittering outfits, her captions filled with confidence. But the comments beneath told a different story. Friends asked pointed questions, hinting that they had heard about the money, while others fell silent altogether. Invitations that once flooded her inbox stopped arriving. The rooftop dinners, the weekend trips, the glamorous parties. Those doors closed one by one, and Olivia found herself standing outside them, no longer welcome. The financial reality hit her just as hard. Without my transfers, the bills that had piled up in the background surged to the surface. Rent notices arrived in quick succession, each stamped with warnings. The car she drove so proudly now carried the threat of repossession. Credit card companies called daily, their voices cold and relentless. For the first time, Olivia had to face the weight of living the life she had pretended to afford. I learned about this not through her words, but through fragments I overheard from others. A cousin mentioned seeing her arguing with a landlord in the hallway of her building. A friend of a friend whispered that she had tried to borrow money again, but this time no one was willing to help. She had burned too many bridges, and the sympathy that might have once saved her had been consumed by the fire of her deceit. I imagined her in that empty apartment, stripped of the luxury she had flaunted, staring at the bills spread across her table with no one left to call. The thought stirred something complicated inside me. Part of me ached for the sister I had once loved, the girl who had come to me in the rain begging for help. But another part of me felt the satisfaction of justice, a quiet vindication after years of being dismissed. This was not revenge in the traditional sense. It was simply the truth catching up to her. Meanwhile, the silence from Daniel spoke louder than any confrontation. He did not return her calls, did not show up at her door. Friends who once gathered around her now drifted away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that clung to her name. Olivia had always thrived in the glow of attention, but now she walked in shadows, the same shadows she had once condemned me to. Her downfall was not dramatic in a single moment, but gradual, like a crown slipping inch by inch until it finally fell to the ground. And with every step she took away from the spotlight, I felt the shift in balance grow stronger. For once, she was the one fading into the background, while the truth of who I was began to take shape in the eyes of everyone else. Back at home, the weight of what had happened at the Christmas party hung over us like a storm cloud that refused to move. The silence in the house was no longer the quiet of routine, but the heavy stillness of shame. My father barely spoke in the days that followed, his once booming voice reduced to mutters and sighs. When relatives called to check in, I could hear the strain in his tone as he struggled to explain what had unfolded. For the first time, Henry Morgan, who had always been so sure of himself, had nothing left to defend. I watched him from a distance as he sat in his study late at night, the door slightly ajar, the glow of a single lamp casting deep shadows across his face. His hands would rest on the armrests of his chair, motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own mistakes. Once he had carried himself with pride, always ready to raise his glass in Olivia's honor. But now the glass sat untouched beside him, the wine gone stale. One evening, as I passed by, I heard him whisper to himself, his voice breaking. "I did this? I made her believe she could get away with it. I blinded myself." His words stopped me in my tracks. It was the first time I had ever heard him take responsibility. The first time he admitted that his endless favoritism had consequences. The realization that his pride had fueled Olivia's deception seemed to crush him more than the scandal itself. My mother tried to soothe him, though her voice carried an edge of exhaustion. "Henry," she said gently one night, "you never saw Alice. You only saw Olivia. And look where it's led us." The words, though softly spoken, struck hard. My father didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, his face collapsing into his hands as though the truth was too much to bear. For me, the shift was strange. I had spent my life aching for his recognition, but now, as he looked at me with guilt etched into every line of his face, I felt no triumph. His regret was not a gift to me. It was a burden he carried alone. Yet beneath the guilt in his eyes, I also saw something else. Acknowledgement. For the first time, he looked at me and did not dismiss me. He saw the daughter who had endured in silence, the one he had mocked while praising another. That acknowledgement, small as it was, felt like a crack of light in the darkness that had defined us for so long. The household dynamic shifted. Relatives who once ignored me began to check in, their words cautious but sincere. Some apologized for never speaking up, while others admitted they had suspected the truth but had chosen silence. Their guilt, like my father's, was a reminder of how long I had carried this weight alone. In those days after the party, Olivia faded further into the background, while my father sat face to face with the consequences of his favoritism. And in that quiet reckoning, I realized that though the truth had shattered my family, it had also begun to rebuild the way they looked at me. In the quiet that followed those chaotic days, I found myself caught between two conflicting tides of emotion. On one side was the relief that had eluded me for so long. The truth was finally spoken, and with it came a freedom I had never known. I no longer had to sit silently at the family table while my father mocked me and exalted Olivia. I no longer had to swallow the ache of invisibility. For the first time, people looked at me and saw me as more than the quiet shadow in the corner. That recognition, subtle as it was, lifted a weight from my shoulders that had been pressing down for years. Yet, alongside that relief was a hollow ache, one that grew sharper the more I thought about Olivia. She was my sister. No matter the jealousy, the comparisons, the lies, a part of me had always loved her. I remembered us as children, lying on the same bed on Christmas Eve, whispering secrets in the dark, waiting for morning. Back then, before our father's favoritism carved a canyon between us, she was simply my little sister who looked at me with trust. That memory haunted me now. When she first came to me in tears 2 years ago, drenched in rain and desperation, I had seen a glimpse of that sister again. I helped her not because I was weak, but because I wanted to believe that beneath all the glitter, there was still something real between us. But as the months passed and her requests multiplied, I realized she had chosen her image over our bond. And when she let our father believe she was supporting me, she didn't just lie to him. She betrayed the last thread of sisterhood we had left. At night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I wrestled with that contradiction. I was proud of myself for breaking the silence, for standing tall when everyone expected me to shrink. But I also mourned what had been lost. The sister I once protected was gone, replaced by someone who had built her life on deception. Exposing her had been necessary, but it also meant accepting that the relationship we once had could never return. There were moments when I wondered if I could have done things differently. If I had refused her the first time she asked for help, would she have learned to stand on her own? If I had spoken up sooner, would the lies have grown so large? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, but the answers never came. What remained was the simple truth that choices had been made, and we were both paying the price. Still, amid the grief, there was a quiet strength that kept me moving forward. I had spent years defined by comparisons, by silence, by sacrifice. Now I was defined by something else: the courage to speak when it mattered most. The loss of my sister weighed heavily, but the rediscovery of myself was a gift I could not ignore. In the wreckage of our family's illusions, I was finally beginning to see who I truly was. When the door clicked shut behind Olivia, the apartment fell into silence once more. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the knob, my heart heavy yet strangely light at the same time. For years, I had lived with the weight of invisibility, buried under comparisons and lies. Now, for the first time, I had chosen to put myself first. The pain was real, but so was the freedom. I walked back to my desk, the place where I had fought to build a life no one saw until it was undeniable. The soft glow of the computer screen lit the room, casting light on the very space where I had once cried in exhaustion and silence. Tonight, it felt different. This wasn't just a desk anymore. It was proof that I had survived, that I had built something no one could take away from me. As I sat there, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The humiliation at family dinners, the countless sacrifices, the bitterness of watching Olivia shine with borrowed light. I thought about my father's pride, my family's silence, the way I had been overlooked again and again. And then I thought about the courage it had taken to finally speak, to break the silence, to reclaim my story. Life had taught me a lesson I would never forget. Sometimes the hardest battles are not against others, but against the voice inside you that says you are not enough. I had lived under that voice for so long, letting it dictate my worth, letting it silence me. But the truth was always there, waiting for me to claim it. My worth was never tied to my father's toasts or my sister's lies. It was in my persistence, my strength, my refusal to give up even when no one believed in me. Olivia's downfall was painful to watch, and a part of me would always mourn the sister I lost along the way. But her choices were hers, just as mine were mine. And by finally choosing myself, I had broken the cycle that had trapped me for so long. I had proven, not to them but to myself, that I was not invisible. As I leaned back in my chair, I imagined the countless people out there who might feel the way I once did, overlooked, dismissed, unseen. To them, I wanted to say this: your silence does not define you. Your worth is not measured by the praise of others. You are stronger than you realize, and the day you choose to stand up for yourself is the day your life begins to change. This is my story. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I hope it reminds you that your voice matters. Don't let anyone take it away from you. Thank you for watching and for standing with me through this journey. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge Stories so we can keep telling the stories that prove even in the darkest families, justice and strength can shine through.